Okay, with this important title, we should stay here for a semester, and I have to explain this issue in 20 minutes. So I hope I can give some interest idea, share with you some interest idea. I begin. In recent discussion in different social and human science has emerged the questions about the timelessness and meaning of placing Vatican II at the center of a reflection on the situation and future of the Church life, especially when this analysis is conducted from the perspective of the so-called Global South. I am referring to the works that, sparked by cultural studies and subaltern studies in English, have been increasingly developing in Latin America and the Caribbean, characterized by the categories, for example, subalternity, coloniality, post-colonialism, decoloniality, geopolitical, of knowledge, and many others. No? Cognitive justice, ecology of knowledge. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a very important thinker with a huge impact in our region. It's not necessary to share all this historical interpretation or theoretical analysis, even due to the diversity, to recognize that all these positions at least hold well-founded warnings. I have to recognize since the beginning that I'm not coloniality and decoloniality is not a field of my research, but it's the environment in which we are living. So that's why important that, as many theologians, me too, we have a concern to understand the main intentions, the most important critics, the core demands, the hearts of the issue. That's why you will find in my presentation some precise words or perspective that I can share, that I want to share with you. In the following presentation, first I refer to a general objection formulated from this decolonial perspective, and which particularly raised the question of the intercultural nature of the Council. Then I offer some thoughts by paying attention to two aspects. On the one hand, the interpretation of the Council that is adopted is almost decisive. That's important. Which kind of Council are you criticizing? This presupposes an adequate knowledge of Vatican II. On the other hand, the historical process of the ecclesial communities of our continent after the Council has been fruitful, also, I underline also thanks to Vatican II, not only because Vatican II. Precisely along the fundamental lines that the decolonial perspective have called for. One phrase in the final reflection, I am telling you the end of the film. One phrase in the final reflection reflects my proposal. The Council essentially belongs to the emancipating narrative in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, the first point. In a recent text, the philosopher from Argentina and Mexico, he died last Sunday. He was one of the most important intellectuals, as you know, in our region. Yeah? Enrique Dussel has renewed his proposings regarding the epistemological decolonization of theology. At the beginning, the author recalls Dussel the fact that the topic of epistemological decolonization originated with a group of philosophers, historians, and social scientists from Latin America and of Latino roots in the United States. It is the elaboration of an issue that began with critical works in what is known as culture studies in England, subaltern studies promoted by historians from India, and mainly postmodernist stances in Europe and the United States. He also reminds, in a Latin American perspective, that this decolonization is a further development of the dependency theory, a critique of centralized capitalism in relation to its periphery, liberation theologies, racial issues, feminism and gender, as well as indigenous people. It is structured under what has been called, for a very important sociology from Peru, the coloniality of power, which rose in the horizons of liberation theology, where we find several Latin Americans and Latinos philosophers, including Dussel. In this complex web, to which many nuances and names should be added, the topic of epistemological decolonizations emerged. At the end of his text, Dussel makes a few assertions that seems worthy of noting here. He highlights two aspects. First, the fact that, in his view, even the great theologians of the 20th century, such as Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, Yves Congar, and Jürgen Moltmann, were, and Dussel underlined, and could not be Eurocentric. They creatively renew European theologies, but they were unable to situate their subjectivity, even their corporality, within the colonial space in the world of the colonized other. And the second remark of Dussel, he includes a brief but significant statement about the Council. That's what's my interest here. Vatican II fixes or resolved the distance of the Church with the Enlightenment through an intra-European ecumenism, but not with the colonial world. In this context, Dussel, not without irony, criticized academics from the global south. I think there is a yes. Yeah, I'm quoting him. Latin American, African, and Asian students who were thought the best European theology, describing different strategies and paths followed in their diverse biographies. Dussel warns of brainwashing that caused students from the South to be transformed into Eurocentric intellectuals. And as they returned to their culture space of origin, they found themselves in a colonized world, alienated from their own culture and from their own popular religious imaginary. The author saves from this diagnosis very few instances, for example, Gustavo Gutiérrez, belonging to Latin American liberation theology, who saw with their own heads, that's his expression, taking advantage of elements from critical social science that Eurocentric theology had never used. For example, he enumerates Marxism, psychoanalysis, etc. In his final evaluation, Dussel states that, I'm quoting, the epistemological decolonization of theology is a fact that began during the second half of the 20th century, but which will last the entire 21st century. We have a long way before us. In this context, moreover, he warns that said decolonizations, I'm quoting, begins by situating ourselves in a new space. I am underlining in my presentation the idea of the space, the locations, where you think from. from which, as locus enunciationis and original hermeneutic, it will be necessary to redo theology as a whole. In fact, as several authors shows, the criticism against this hermeneutical limitation has not been exclusively directed toward theology, that's important, but also to other fields of knowledge and academia. No, we are not the only sinners. Yeah. It has even not only been directed, it has even not only been directed to a more conservative ideological arc. That is interesting too. Precisely as Juan Blanco from El Salvador has noted, I quote, culture studies rose as an alternative theoretical, methodological, and epistemological strategy to the blindness of canonical disciplines and the left essentialist ideologies. Mass culture, the demand of exclude groups, encourage the creation of new and more inclusive academic modes for the understanding of emerging sociocultural phenomena. The rupture with this, again, place, the utopia of knowledge, is what brought Walter Vignolo, who was quoted yesterday from one college, Walter Vignolo, a key author in this perspective with great impact in Latin America, because he's from Argentina. He lives and teaches in USA, but he's from Argentina. To recognize the need of making what he calls the geopolitics of knowledge visible, I insist on location. Since we have already known for a long time that all thinking is located. However, in spite of this, there is a general tendency to accept thinking that is constructed by European history, and that experience is delocalized. The blindness toward the particular situation of knowledge is what made the hegemonic self-awareness of the West possible. They argue, and therefore the insistence on the importance of the own situated intellectual tradition, that it's product of a given place of enunciation, is a specific axis held throughout this author's theoretical production. This epidemic blindness, shared by the most diverse individual leadership, social, political and ecclesial, and social and human science, can be identified in multiple examples of denied alternatives in the continent's, in our continent's narrative. It's not only a European problem, it's our own problem. One of the most relevant, which considered the most invisible minority in Latin America, the Afro-descendant population that arrived with the slave trade between the 17th and 19th centuries. Although the figures related to its population, which is very heterogeneous, lack the desired precision, it is estimated that they represent over 20% of the continent's population, with a strong concentration in Brazil and Cuba. In 2015, a total of 130 million Afro descendants are estimated. Multiple indicators shows a growing awareness of the complexity of this world, strongly marked by racism, poverty, and marginality. Fortunately, there is some change in the region, as it's shown by several international reports. So, I come to the second point, the Vatican II. The proposition by Dussel would need a detailed analysis of each assertion, of course, but it cannot be denied that they shed light on a key issue of the continental debate in the last decades. Here, with its particular of interest, is his reference to the Council. I quote, Vatican II fixes or resolved the distances of the Church with the Enlightenment through an intra-European ecumenism, but not with the colonial world. With this statement, the question is raised on the sense of placing Vatican II at the center, for example, of an international work project precisely from an intercultural and forward-thinking perspective. In the case of Dussell's proposition, the difficulty lies in the lack of attention from the Council to a key current issue, which to a great extent amount to the demand of the colonial turn in all levels of thinking and action. Due to its temporal situation and its geographic ecclesial location, again, highly visible in the main agenda and the active participation of its leading actors, Vatican II seems to have a radical limitation. Radical. How to answer briefly to these important remarks by Dussell and other authors? Is it theologically adequate to consider Vatican II as the starting point and software of a future world church, imagined in post-colonial terms? I would like in a few minutes to offer an answer by paying attention to the different aspects. On the one hand, the interpretation of the Council that is adopted is decisive. On the other hand, the historical process of the ecclesial communities in our continent after the Council has been fruitful, as I said before, also thanks to Vatican II, precisely along the fundamental lines that the decolonial perspective had called for. So I will deal with these two aspects. The first, the reflection about the Council. The above reflection can be analyzed from the basis of the conciliar work from different points of view, of course. A key global perspective, one of the most relevant in the current theological context in an intercultural perspective, is found, in my opinion, in the opinion of other colleagues, of course, is found in the understanding of pastorality in the work of Christoph Theobald, maybe one of the most important current interpretation of the Council. The concept of pastorality resulting from the way of proceeding coded in the Vatican II writing is decisive, very similar to the synodal process. It entails a constitutive relationship between the announcement of the gospel and together, it addresses that the novelty of Vatican II and consists of conjugating, the title of one of my articles, conjugating a hermeneutic of the gospel and at the same time, inseparable, a hermeneutic of the language and culture susceptible to receiving the good news of Christ. End of quotation. This approach implies a stereophonic listening and several practices. First, the ecclesial hearing of the Word of God, especially concretized through the reading of the Bible, the Verbum, and second, the reading of the sign of the time, the Gaudium Spes. Listen to the voice of God is only possible in a stereophonic listening of the multiple voice of our time. That's a wonderful expression of Gaudium Spes 44. And he adds, in the resounding in our conscience. These two readings or listenings cannot be separated, or they would both fail. The interpretation of the Bible, or the whole tradition, and the interpretation of the current times. One further step. On the other hand, the dual intrinsically linked hermeneutical task cannot be concretized unless such practices are rooted in the ability to listen and learn. If there is no previous spiritual initiation to the access to the inner self and eventually to personal, individual and liturgical conversations with God, has to do with the spiritual conversation. This practice takes place within the illimited plurality of the contextualized experience location, of their protagonism and addresses. In addition, they imply a mutual form of understanding, a common search for truth, with non-authoritarian strategies based on dialogue and argumentations, carried out and concretized in a conciliar or synodal way. This way of proceeding, the double listening and the several practice, originates, that's the third step, originates an ecclesio-genetic process, a foundation of the church from below, as described by Vatican II. Yes? Yeah, no, it's okay, it's okay. Thank you, Leo. The founding perspective of the primitive community does not exert a structuring function in Lumen Gentium. That's important. Hence, the invitation to interpret the global vision of Lumen Gentium from the ecclesiogenetic perspective of the mission document. In this view, this council-invented grammar, that's the expression from Theobald, constitutes a means to shape today Christian and ecclesial existence within our own cultural context. This is about an ecclesiogenetic process, about the search for an image of the church that bears a message for the future. This framework of ideas allows for a better understanding of the concept of pastorality. I'm quoting, it constitutes a way of expressing this new complexity about a contextualized listening of the Word of God in the heart of a historical learning process which has somehow crystallized during Vatican II as a legacy for posterity. Maybe the most decisive teaching for the future of Vatican II lies in this pastoral way of proceeding, not the content, not the, in first place, not the content, but the way of proceeding, a synodal way of proceeding. Yeah? So I come to my final point, the post-conciliar process in Latin America. I believe that given this analysis, the Latin American and Caribbean process of reception of Vatican II should be further valued, since it has focused precisely on what concerns the pastorality proposed by the Council. That's why the Council has a good name in Latin America, a good name. Nobody wants to be pre-conciliar or anti-conciliar. First, the Bible in the hands of the people. This constitutes the main event in the reception of Vatican II, according to historian from Brazil, from São Paulo, José Oscar de Osso. I quote, "The legacy of the Council found its most significant and creative expression in the reading of the Bible by the common folk, a wide community appropriation," that's new in the history of our continent, appropriation of the Word of God, which nurtured the path for basic ecclesial communities and social pastoral activity through these years, with the leading role of the laity, especially women. This statement has gained significant consensus on the part of many authors. Secondly, the theological and pastoral practice of interpreting the sign of the time, this a key word in the theological bibliography of our continent, sign of the time. This fundamental experience reveals that Gaudium et Spes was the council text with the highest impact on the life of the church in the continent. This double listening and reading, this inseparable stereophonic listening, Bible, tradition, and the current times, was concretized in our continent in a continuous hermeneutical circle, even when this had not been always made explicit enough or methodological well-founded. Thirdly, the perspective of a church founded from below, and not a top-down model from ad gentes rather than from Lumen Gentium point of view, to a certain extent characterized the ecclesiology of the Conference of Medellin and its valoration of the small community. As you know, the development of the so-called basic ecclesial community, which to a large extent is considered a typical phenomenon of the Latin American post-council period. It was precisely in this context, historical and thematical context, that the concept of ecclesiogenesis was coined. Yeah. This way of proceeding led to a process of reprinting which resulted in some sort of new identity, a way of proceeding for a new identity. In the history of the Church, the post-conciliar Latin American ecclesial figure, something new in the history of the Church, but for sure in our own history, with the option for the poor as its most significant symbol, as you well know. This is about the irruption of the poor, a theological locus, topos and kairos, both, which became the decisive existential periphery for the interpretation of the gospel. With regards to theology, regarding theology, the consideration mature in the continent of the theologian, that's from a colleague here, as an organic intellectual that is personally committed to the cause of liberation and the characterization of the poor as theologian, core of Latin American theology, holds immense importance. So, my final reflections. Ecclesial communities and within them, theologians from the Latin American and Caribbean continent have been aware of the predominantly European character of the conciliar debate, of course. The most evident limitation has been observed, maybe, in the little success the topic of the Church of the Poor had in the conciliar agenda, as you well know. But far from viewing Vatican II in a negatively, for decades they have offered a positive judgment in an overwhelming majority through many publications and events, considering the Council as a Pentecostes always read with the pastoral intention of Pope John, the significant encyclica Populorum Progressio, the Gaudium Spes for the Third World, that's the expression from Gustavo Gutierrez, and above all, the greatest Catholic event in the continent in the 20th century, the Medellin Conference. This positive assessment is easily observable. That's an important information for me. Not only the liberation's theology from the 70s, but also in the later current feminist, indigenous, and African American theological movement and theology. That's important for the argumentation, for the argumentations. Yeah? In sum, we can observe that, I'm finishing, the self-awareness of a regional church, the rise of a contextual location, the rise of a contextual theology with international relevance for the first time in the history, such as liberation theology. The consecration of a pastoral work and theological research methodology, not only pastoral work, but theological methodology that is mainly focused on localizations. You begin to reflect your faith, paying attention to your culture, ecclesial, economic context. That's a decolonial starting point. The rise of one of the greatest ecclesial and theological novelties of our era as the option for the poor, increasingly understood more plurally, the acknowledgement that this evangelical dimension of justice demands deep political transformation, not just individual conversion, and which is presented as a structural critique in the face of an institutionalized violence, a very known expression of Medellin, are all the realities which, in the light of an enormous amount of people, are intrinsically, that's the point, are intrinsically related to Vatican II. That's why the Council essentially belongs to the emancipating narrative in Latin America and the Caribbean. The same Latin American author that Dussel mentioned as example because, in his opinion, they thought with their own heads, as Gustavo Gutierrez, are a testimony of this narrative. Zum Schluss, according to this analysis, deepening the study of Vatican II with that intercultural perspective can serve to further the ground covered by the Christian community in the continent, and at the same time to meet some of the most important challenges that demand political transformation processes, struggles in favor of socio-economic equality, the recognition of denied alterities and cultures, the coloniality. End of the film.